Now, the issue of creating a fair and just society for all has been a hot topic of national discussion in recent years. In a written parliamentary reply last February, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said the issues of mitigating income inequality, ensuring social mobility and enhancing social integration are critical.
And PM Lee also went on to note that failure to do so could result in a fractured society and vicious politics as well. So since then, the government has put in place various measures to address inequality and enhance social mobility, creating a society for all.
Among them is the Uplifting Pupils and Life and Inspiring Families Task Force, or more simply known as Uplift, led by Second Minister for Education and Finance as well, Indranee Rajah. And just last week, she spoke on how 4G leaders intend to tackle inequality. And to discuss this and more this morning, we have the Second Minister for Finance and Education herself, Ms. Indranee Rajah, in the studio with us. She's also the minister in the Prime Minister's office. Good morning, Minister, and welcome to Asia First. It's a pleasure to have you.
Very nice to have you here, Miss Indranee. My goodness, it's been, I think, a couple of months since we've last spoken, but I'm glad to jump in on this conversation with you. There's a vision of a society of opportunities throughout life. What are the factors that have pushed this issue to the top of the 4G's priorities?
A few things. You know, being a fair and just society is not a new concept. It first appeared in the Proclamation of Singapore. So in 1965, we were grappling with these issues already. But over time, we've made a lot of progress. But now, because of things that have been happening globally, it's manifesting, the issue is manifesting itself in a new form. We've got some challenges, right? You've got technology, which is driving change. The kind of economy that we'll have in the future is very knowledge-driven. And at the same time, you have the gaps that are growing, partly because as we have prospered, the resources have accrued differently to high, middle, and lower income. And as those with more resources get further ahead, the ones with fewer resources get left further behind. In the Singapore context, it's a small group. But as the others pull ahead, the gap can widen. And we really don't want that. That was what PM Lee was talking about.
Right.
So the key for us is how do we help those who are disadvantaged to catch up, to level up. We don't want to hold those who can run fast back, right? But you want to help those who don't have the same advantages to be able to catch up with the others.
There are some people in Singapore who feel that meritocracy, long a vanguard of Singapore, is to blame, for this current problems that we're facing in terms of inequality and the lack of social mobility. How are you responding, the government that is, to this call to abolish or to rethink meritocracy?
It's not a question of blame. You know, circumstances in life just are.
Yep.
When we started out and then you have a family who has more resources and invest in their children and their children invest in their children, you can't blame them for that, right?
Yep.
And remember when we introduced meritocracy, it was really as an antidote to corruption, to nepotism, to favoritism. It was a way of ensuring that the people with the best ability for a particular position get that job. So I don't think you should do away with meritocracy. That's not our approach. But what you have to do is you have to enable those who don't have the same advantages to be able to access the opportunities, because that's the key.
Okay.
You can present equal opportunities, but different people have different ability to access it. So what we really need is an enabling meritocracy, where you bridge the gaps, you narrow the shortfalls, and you help all to advance together.
How about the charge that meritocracy right now is too narrowly defined?
It depends on how you're defining it. So I would just say, at least in my view, meritocracy just simply means that the person who has the ability to fulfill a position should be the person to get it.
Okay.
Now, what you don't want is a scenario where only a select or limited few have that ability to meet it. What you want to do is to be able to ensure that across the board, across our education system and across different profiles, even those from lower income, disadvantaged backgrounds have a chance to fulfill that position. So it means that just because you come from a low income family or disadvantaged background, you should not be denied opportunities to access better paying jobs, to be able to be in good positions. And you can see that all the moves that we've made at MOE are really designed to try and make sure that everybody gets a good chance.
Okay.
Uplift is part of it, but we've got the remedial programs that we've put in schools. We have things like financial assistance to make sure that children with financial difficulties don't lose out. You've got the opportunity fund so that in case they need to go on excursions or overseas trips, they're not prevented from doing so just for lack of finances.
You know, if the idea is not to cap the top but to uplift the bottom, would it be fair to maybe understand that those at the bottom might then be getting a little bit more help? And what if it is seen as an unfair move or to be giving them some sort of an unfair advantage later on?
It's not so much a question of unfair advantage simply because what you're doing is you're trying to narrow the gap. So those who are ahead, they're able to manage on their own. It's the ones who don't have the same resources, who can't manage on their own, and that's where you have to intervene. When we looked at it, we realized that there were actually, this is based on the feedback, right, then when we were doing the uplift exercise, a lot of it is centered around the family circumstances. Those who don't do so well in school, four main factors: long-term absenteeism, and that usually is also a result of the family situation, either parents working on shift or they have some family situation at home that doesn't allow them to get to school on time. After school environment, because if let's say it's very noisy at home, the television's always on, or younger children are running around making a lot of noise, the older ones can't study, that also has an impact. Resilience and motivation. Because if you start out and you don't, and you feel that at least you have not done well in your subjects, you get discouraged, demotivated. So this idea of building resilience, building confidence, self-motivation is very important. And then, of course, the family situation. Because different families have different situations. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's domestic issues, sometimes it's parental issues. So these are the things that we have to look at.
So when you look at all these four factors, as you mentioned, right, what's the challenge? What's the challenge in trying to meet all four of them all at once? I mean, I know this is a joint effort between you and your colleague, Desmond Lee, in terms of trying to reach out to these families. But do they actually want this help? Do they know where to go, for example?
Not all do.
Yeah.
So I would say when you speak to some of these families, there is a clear sense that they want to do better, right? Not all are able to do so on their own. So you need, what you really need is a coordinated effort, and you need everybody to feel that they have a stake in this. So coordinated effort on the part of government would mean MOE, MSF, to some extent MND also, because there's a question of rental housing. Some of them would need housing, and hopefully housing near the school, so it's not too far for the child to travel. What MSF has been doing is bringing social services closer to the ground. They've set up the social service offices, and now they're trying to make sure that it's much more coordinated. So let's say if you go to a SSO for financial assistance, but you have a housing issue, then at the SSO, they will help you to coordinate and connect with HDB so that the resident doesn't have to go running around, it's inconvenient time and cost. But it also does require, on the part of the families, a desire to be invested in the children's future, and then also the willingness to take ownership of some of the issues, recognizing that this is a journey you have to walk together. It's not one where you go in there in a very judgmental way and say, oh, you should do this or you should do that, but really approaching it from the viewpoint that these are our fellow Singaporeans. They have issues. There are many things we can do to help. We've got to make sure that the help reaches them, and in a way that they also feel inspired and motivated, that there is a prospect for them and their families.
I want to ask you about streaming. One of the earliest criticisms of streaming when they came out was the fact that sometimes you were pigeonholing students who weren't so strong. They went to the normal stream, and then they became typecast, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. Do you think the changes that have been put forward by the Education Ministry go some way towards fixing this issue?
It would be helpful, actually, if I explain the effect of streaming and what happened, and that's the context for the current moves. Streaming has been much misunderstood, I think, because What many people don't realize is that prior to streaming, we had nearly 45% dropout rate. That means nearly 45% of cohort didn't complete secondary school education. Can you imagine what that means in terms of inequality? It means 45% of a cohort is not able to access opportunities. The thinking behind streaming was really that different people learn at different paces, different talents and abilities, and you must teach according to pace and where the student is. And the results were actually quite dramatic. Almost immediately after streaming was introduced, the dropout rates fell dramatically. And even after normal tech was introduced, they fell further, such that our dropout rate now is less than 1%. So that tells you that the idea of teaching according to pace, ability, works. But what happened along the way, which was unintended, was that by categorizing people into different groups, then you had this thing about stigmatization. And that could also lead to very self-limiting ideas like, oh, I'm in this category, so I can't go further. And that we really did not want, because our underlying philosophy is that everyone has potential. How do you bring that potential to the fore? Teaching according to ability is one way, but it's then counterproductive if you limit that person's mindset. So what we introduce now is subject-based banding, which means that you're not put into big categories. Well, when you first go in, obviously, after PSLE, you'll have to do some sorting, right? But after that, you just take the subjects according to your ability. So you may be very good in English, not so good in maths, and you may be very good in science, not so good in second language. That we'll just group you according to subjects, no longer sticking a label on you, as it were. And it allows for much more mixing among students of different abilities, different groups. The schools will have to find their own ways of how they want to group them. Minister Ong Ye Kung gave the example of one school which grouped them according to CCA, which actually worked quite well, but different schools may have a different way of doing it. So hopefully in this way, you can still retain that principle of teaching according to ability and according to students' pace, but at the same time remove stigmatization.
Right, and it encourages the mixing of students of different levels as well. And hopefully some of the good things will rub off onto the weaker students. I suppose that's part of the idea as well.
Yes, that's part of the idea, but it works both ways also, because you want people to see themselves as just part of the same group, and not that I belong to this group and you belong to that group. And that mixing helps with making them interact, and better still, working together.
Okay. We've actually talked about the bigger picture of meritocracy. Now let's focus perhaps on creating a just society. You know, Ms. Indranee, last week at NUS, you talked about some kinds of rapid technology-driven changes that have worsened wage dispersion. So let's talk about technology as, something that could dampen social mobility. What are your priorities in this area, and really, where do you start at so many different levels?
The key is building a society of opportunities at every stage of life. I know that sounds like a big phrase, a big slogan. What does it actually mean? It means really that every point of the way, you want to give people a chance to advance. So there will be some who, if their family background is they have good resources, etc., they're able to do this quite easily. But for disadvantaged children, one example may be there's a pilot program now called Kickstart. Kickstart, where you work with the mothers from the time of pregnancy on nutrition, on how to engage the children, because nutrition is very important for the child's development. When the child is born, the research shows that age 0 to 3 is when you have the important years for the child's social emotional development. And in fact, a lot of what happens to the child in those first 3 years determine a lot of what that child would be in the years to come. A child who has witnessed domestic violence, for example, within that age, it leaves a mark, an imprint on them, almost a permanent imprint in some cases. So you want to be sure that you're able to catch that at an early stage.
Okay.
Then let's say somebody didn't do so well academically in school after they left secondary. You'll see that we've created multiple pathways. There's ITE, there's Polytechnic, there's university. And from ITE, you can either work or you can go to poly. From poly also, you can either work or you can go to university. And we're also trying to create pathways where for some who've had to go to work early for whatever reason, you can come back and study. So you can see that you can ultimately reach the place where you want to be, but not everybody has to go the same path.
Right. Okay. I don't want to paint a doomsday scenario. So intervention along multiple points along one's life, I guess, lifespan
Yes.
is critical. So what would happen if you didn't do that? I mean, you talked about new fault lines that can emerge. What are some of these possible new fault lines?
So if you don't intervene,
Yeah.
it basically means that the gaps will get wider.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be gaps between the haves and the have-nots. It would lead to polarization, dissension, and a feeling that Singapore is only a place for some and not for others. And Singapore has always been about unity. It's always been about this is a place for everyone. We've talked about it in terms not just of race, religion, but also in terms of opportunities. And you want your fellow Singaporeans to do well. That's what keeps us united. We don't want to have a society that's marked by different classes or different groups. You won't have exactly the same outcomes for everybody.
Right.
You're not going to have exactly the same occupations. But there must be this sense that we're all Singaporeans in this together. We're going to help each other. We're going to make sure that we have good outcomes. Because then you stay invested in your country, and that's how your country stays strong. You look at what's happening around the world today when you have countries where there are groups that are polarized and some who feel that, they have been shut out or locked out of advantages. It has a very debilitating effect on the country.
I want to go back to technology because
Sure.
I have a sense of how, kids from a very young age, from Kids Start to maybe at school, they can catch up with technology. But what about those in small businesses, those in the later part of their lives, in training individual workers? How do we make sure they catch up?
Good question, because I feel it myself too. As when you're older and you're confronted with something new, there's always that nervousness. But if we don't adopt technology, if we don't get on the bandwagon, then people will be left behind. Individuals get left behind, businesses get left behind, and then overall it wouldn't be very good for us. So for SMEs, you will notice that in the last few budgets, there has been funds set aside to help them to digitalize. It's called the SME Go Digital Scheme, for example. Even through the industry transformation maps, we've been working through with how to help workers and people in different sectors adopt technology. And there's that overall need for a mindset shift to help people not to fear technology, but to see opportunities in it. And the key really is it's basically helping people to not be afraid of it. I don't know about you, but every time I'm confronted with new technology, I'm just so worried that if I
You need somebody to help you.
Yeah. If I press this button, the whole thing's going to disappear.
Yeah,
right?
Well, thank you for spending $1 million.
Oh, really? Has that come to that, Arnold?
No, it hasn't. I fear that though.
Ms. Indranee, I know that tomorrow you're attending an event for women lawyers. I mean, that's the industry that you came from. I mean, I'm trying to fish for another example here.
Okay.
What do you think about the legal industry, for example? I mean, this is really what a lot of young kids aspire to do in Singapore. I want to be a lawyer, just like you. How do you think this particular industry needs to catch up in order to meet with technological demands and not be left behind?
Okay. This one is a challenging one, right? Because the whole ethos of being a lawyer is that it's based on precedent. You look at past cases, you look at past standard form contracts. So your entire life is looking back at things which have been done. And what you really need when you want to change this sector is getting them to look forward and ahead, which actually many will do when they are able to sort of focus and pay attention to that. But for those lawyers in practice, a lot of it is I've got to deal with this now. My client's asking for this particular piece of work now. It's very difficult to sort of say, I'm going to sit down, focus on the future. So I would say that for law firms, what is necessary is you need someone in the firm to start thinking about what is the shape of the industry, what should our firm be doing to respond to this, And you also find that many of the younger lawyers have a lot of good ideas. I've met a number of them who started out in practice, but decided that because they were very interested in technology and coding, they've actually gone into startups of their own to try and improve processes, because when they, as young lawyers, found that they had to spend a lot of time doing things manually, which didn't make sense to them. So we're hoping that it's called legal tech. So we're hoping that the space of legal tech will start to take off, and that firms, especially the older lawyers, will adopt.
Watch that space.
Okay, indeed, we should watch that space. I also want to bring it back to, if I may, the broader, economy, and for Singapore as well. You talk about the need to look forward. What sort of challenges do you have in trying to convince Singaporeans that this is something that really needs to be done? We need to make sure that everyone who needs a leg up at various points of their life gets the leg up, and they don't feel a sense of resentment. What about me? You often hear the middle class saying, I'm left out of this various programs. You're taking care only of maybe the lower income workers. What about the rest of us?
One of the big challenges is getting employers on board for this. Employers are used to an economy where you employ somebody who already has the skills that you want. But the economy is changing so quickly that when somebody leaves school, within 5 years, the skill sets that they had already need to change, and they need to adapt. So what this means is that employers also need to be on board with training. What we've done as part of the Future Economy Game Plan is to encourage employers to come on board through the trade associations and chambers, because we recognize that each sector is not the same. What you might do in logistics, for example, is very different from what you might do in preschool, which is, again, very different from what you might do in healthcare. So the thinking behind that was each sector needs to have an industry transformation map. The trade associations and chambers for that sector need to be on board. And what the government can do is provide funding, which helps with to encourage them to train and to upskill. We set up Workforce Singapore to basically do job matching. But I think that the key really is employers must be willing to give, especially older workers, a chance, be willing to come on board to train. MOM has introduced, for example, the Adapt and Grow schemes. And we've also introduced the professional conversion programs to help people from one sector change to another sector. Take-up's not too bad, but I think could be a lot better. And we really do need the employers on board for this.
Okay, so trying to convince them to it's almost a mindset change to a degree, I guess, both on the part of employers and also workers. Are workers more receptive to the idea of making sure they stay current and upgrading their skills?
I think by and large they are, but it's very important to do so in a way that motivates a worker.
Okay.
Because the person must feel that, hey, I'm actually learning something new. This is opening a new door, a new opportunity. And we've done quite a number of these things. It shouldn't be that the person feels that, I have to do this because there's no other choice. It should be much more of a case that, hey, I want to do this because it means I'm going to learn something new, and it means I'm off on a new trajectory. And for the employer side, they should also remember that if you have, you must create an environment where people are happy to work, where they feel that they are being supported, and to create employee loyalty.
Right.
And employees are loyal when they feel happy in a workplace. Different companies do it differently, some more successfully than others, but I think that that's the key. Obviously, pay is important, but any employee will tell you it's more than just about pay. It's also about the environment, colleagues, workplace culture, and that's something that I think employers should focus on.
We have talked about some of the programs you've put in place and some of the policies and strategies that you have in place as well, Minister. Let's focus in on one, zoom in on one, which is your Uplift Task Force, which is brand new, recently announced, engaging sessions with community partners right now. Can you tell us what you're learning so far and what you intend to do, from these outreach sessions?
The outreach sessions were very helpful because when we started with Uplift, we didn't want to go into it with preconceived ideas. We wanted to really hear from people who were at the front line.
Okay.
These are the social workers, the student welfare officers in schools, the teachers, etc. So the 4 points I talked about earlier came from them. But one of the biggest takeaways that we received from them was the need for coordination. Because they were saying that, we have many programs, and you do have many community groups. You have volunteer welfare organizations who want to do stuff, but they also need to be connected with the students who need the assistance. And in some cases, they weren't quite sure how to navigate it because some things might fall under MND, mental housing, some might fall under MSF, which is the financial assistance, some specialized subsections of MSF, for example, domestic violence, etc. And then others may be in relation to MOE because of what's happening in school. So big takeaway was need for better coordination. And that's why, as a result, we decided to set up an office known as the Uplift Program Office at MOE. But that's just the MOE side of the house. MOE will also have to coordinate with MSF, and MSF coordinates with HDB, with MND, and also with MHA, because in some instances you may have juvenile crime and things which impact on the family under the MHA portfolio.
So you have at least 4 ministries there that we're talking about. Does it actually
That's quite a bit of coordination.
That sounds like a bit of coordination. Is it?
Yes.
Is it really going to be easier, you think, ultimately? I mean, are the plans in place, or are you still looking at how to improve it and set it up?
Both MSF and MOE have already got their own frameworks. So what we're doing is connecting the two. So once we've connected the two, then hopefully you'll have a seamless bridge at the ministry level. But you also need to connect at ground level. So that's the second piece that we'll be working on. And in terms of what the community can do, one is within schools, schools are already engaging with some groups because schools have student care centers. So some of the student care centers work with community groups for programs, after-school programs within school. And in my speech, I spoke about one school which works with RSVP, which is a group of senior volunteers. And I visited the school. It was really nice to see the interaction between the children and the volunteers because, in a sense, these are like their surrogate parents or grandparents.
Yes.
Yep.
And relationship was very nice to see. More importantly, you could see that the kids felt safe, that they were confident, they spoke up, and I was very encouraged by that. So that's within the school. But in some cases, you may need to have programs within the community. Marine Parade, for example, under ESM Go Chok Tong, has a very good program where they work with a volunteer welfare group, and they reach out to the kids. There's another one with Dr. Lily Neo. It's called Readable. It's a group of young people who work with the children on reading, tuition, various other academic programs.
Okay.
So you can see how this is something where everybody can pitch in together.
Sure.
And you can't have a one-size-fits-all because different constituencies have different profiles and different needs.
Okay.
Sounds very much still like a work in progress, this Uplift. And you did mention that there will be announcements to come as the program develops. Are you able to give us a hint to what areas you're looking at in the future moving forward?
A few things. One, we want to make sure that the coordination is done much better, as I've said.
That seems to be on your mind.
Yes, it is. Because many of them have programs which are already very good.
Yeah.
So you don't have to reinvent the programs. But what you want to do is you want to be able to connect the programs with those who really need it. And then we do need to look at plugging a few gaps. And also the family side of the house.
What are some of these gaps, if I can push you a little bit on that?
In some cases, they don't know where to find the assistance. So you've got to try and make sure that you're able to reach the family to tell them where the assistance can be obtained. And in other instances, it could be something as simple as helping them with parenting. There's a very famous experiment, it's known as the stone face experiment, where they have a young child, the mother's engaging the child at the beginning, then they tell the mom to stop. And then you can see the baby trying to get the mother's attention. Then the baby gets more and more distressed when the mother doesn't react at all. And the purpose of the experiment was to show that at a very young age, children respond to engagement and to interaction from the parents, which means that if, as a parent, you're not aware of this and you're not consciously doing it, it has an impact on your child's development. And something as simple as sharing this with young parents who may not have had children before and who don't, have access to all the research, etc., could make a huge difference in the child's development.
Okay.
Ms. Indranee Rajah is with us, and we want to thank you for sending in your emails and questions via Facebook and also via our email address. Mr. Ng has written in.
That's right. He says, to solve the unemployment issue first, and his suggestion is to put the responsibility of skills future on the employer instead of the employee. So train the employees on the relevant skills after they are put on the job. I mean, your thoughts on that, Minister?
Well, I totally understand where Mr. Ng's coming from. It touches on what I mentioned earlier, although I would say that you can't put the responsibility only on the employer. It has to go both ways, employer and employee, and with government assistance as well, which is what we're aiming for.
Okay.
And you can't also do that. You also have to go upstream, obviously, because in school, it starts all the way from preschool. That's why we say society of opportunities at every stage of life.
Okay.
We started by quoting Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Now let's go to DPM Heng Swee Keat. And he spoke about partnering Singaporeans in the crafting of policy. And this, he believes, will help create even better policies to address social and economic gaps. So it seems like you've learned a lot from speaking with community groups. How do you continue to convince Singaporeans to actively take part and be involved in this ongoing dialogue to create a society for all?
The proof of the pudding is always in the eating, right? So I think it's how Singaporeans see this effort playing out. Uplift is an important example of this because we started out by getting the feedback and the input, and then we designed the recommendations based on that. But even in terms of implementation, it's going to need participation from community.
Right.
That was one example, but I think Minister Masagos also spoke about this in his speech the day before I gave mine, in the environmental realm.
Space, right.
Yeah, because, climate change is a huge issue. It's particularly important for us, Singapore, given that we are low-lying flat. And if you have rising sea levels, that's going to affect us.
Okay.
And there are many things that the community can do together in this area of sustainability.
Right. I'm also very interested to know, apart from the community making sure, and citizens and Singaporeans making sure that they play that part, how precisely or how exactly do 4G leaders like yourself intend to engage more specifically? Do you have specific ideas, town halls or other venues and programs to reach out and to have further engagement?
Yes, and the other 4G leaders will be speaking on different areas at different times, so I don't want to preempt them. But if I could just summarize, there are different levels of participation, all of which are important. One is basically you're getting feedback when you're developing the ideas. That's one level. But two, it could be more than just feedback. It's where you develop something in discussion with the various stakeholders. Ministry of Law and MHA did quite a bit of that when we were working on the penal code reforms, because we had quite intensive discussions with criminal lawyers, etc., because you want their input so that you have a much stronger product. Then there could be some things where in implementation, you will also have to work with people, and Uplift is a good example because implementation is definitely going to need community groups and others to step in. And there may be some areas where, in fact, you can leave that space open and for people to come in and do things which can be done on their own. And at the end of it, there'll also be some spaces which really government still has to take responsibility for and take the lead, because you can't relinquish your responsibility for governance. That's something that you still have to retain.
Okay. For the ordinary Singaporeans, though, that's one I want to ask you as well. I mean, the stakeholders, like, for example, for the Law Ministry, will obviously be people from the legal fraternity. But when it comes to broader policy, what are your plans to engage the ordinary man in the street?
Depends on the policy, right? But you can do so in various ways. You can have direct engagement. So you can have town halls, you can have discussions,
Yep.
you can do so online, and then you can have you set up a specific problem statement and you ask people to come and discuss that and see how you can work on it together. So, or there's something where you already know what the problem statement is. You just say, this is the issue. Please go out there and see what you can do with this. So again, coming back to Uplift, what we did was we had to MOE together with MSF organized a session where we got all the different groups in particular areas to come together. And some of them were meeting each other for the first time and hearing from each other what they were doing for the first time, even though geographically they were very closely related and connected. So that enabled a good discussion to take place, because then it's suddenly like, okay, I can tap on you, and I didn't know you were doing this, and how did I do it?
Yeah.
And, I can refer to you.
Yeah, and then you don't do double work as well.
That's right.
That's really interesting. I want to wrap this conversation up with this question. It sounds like everything's moving nicely. I mean, you've got the ministries trying to come together and talk. You've got the kids and the adults in the various programs trying to do their best to lift themselves off the bottom. You've got community engagement going. Ms. Indranee, do you foresee a perfect scenario? Is it possible to actually reach it?
You're never going to have perfect scenarios, and you're never going to have perfect solutions. But the most important thing is that we try. And if any country can do it, it should be Singapore, given our small size, given the fact that, as a general rule, we all pitch in together. Singaporeans are very helpful people. Yeah. And it's a mission that we've set ourselves on, and I think it's a very worthy mission. So no matter what the challenges and obstacles are, we've got to try.
And you've been listening to the Second Minister for Finance and Education and Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Indranee Rajah, talk about how the government intends to tackle the issues of inequality and the lack of social mobility in certain quarters of Singapore.
And really just creating a society for all. Ms. Indranee, thank you for being here. Do you have a busy day ahead?
I do, but thanks for having me.
No, thank you very much.